And once this loads, Krista, will you confirm that the streaming is beginning on YouTube for me?
Yes, I will.
Thank you.
You are live.
It's interesting that you saw it first, because for me it was still a spinning wheel. Okay. All right. And we got one more minute before we kick it off here, and I'll turn it over to you, Ron. Again, remember to keep yourself muted unless you want to speak. It looks like everybody has done so, with the exception of Doris. Doris on the phone is *6, and Sheila, you're off now, Sheila. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is the County of Dunn, our administration meeting here today. I am Vaughn Hedlund, Chair of the committee, and I'm going to ask our County Manager, Mr. Paul Miller, to call the roll.
Okay. Supervisor Lenow.
Here.
Supervisor Calabrese.
Here.
Supervisor Story.
Here.
Supervisor Tripp.
Here.
Supervisor Bartlett.
Here.
And Chair Hedlund.
Here. All right, we have a quorum. Our next item on our agenda is approval of the minutes. Our last meeting occurred on February 27th of 2020. The minutes were included in your packet. Do I have a motion?
I move.
Jim moves. Is there a second? Tim Lenow seconds. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none. Minutes pass. Next on our agenda is staff reports. The staff reports are in your packet. And so you can read them all. Does anyone at this point have a question on any of those written staff reports? Okay, hearing none, we're going to go forward with item 5 on our agenda, consideration for actions to be taken by the Committee on Administration. Our first is authorizing implementation of a 401A retirement plan benefit and a 457 account change. If our HR department would go forward with that, please.
Yes, you may recall the last few meetings that we've had, we've talked about reviewing the 401A plan. I believe this started a good 12 months ago. Joe started looking into this. It's something that was brought to the county's attention with regard to providing some more flexibility for our staff upon retirement in lieu of using the OPEB and the PEP accounts. So in 2003 and then in 2007, those various accounts were created for employees. The 457 deferred comp plans, we have 3 vendors at this point in time. We've been utilizing various options for 457 accounts for a little over 20 years. When we really got into the RFQ process, we realized as staff that we were maybe a little bit over our head in all of the information and the numbers. So we did enlist M3 Financial to help us review those proposals after we received them. Grant Argyle from M3 Financial is on the call if there's questions, detailed questions regarding any of the proposals. We invited him to help us today. When we reviewed it, we narrowed it down to 5 companies that were considered. We looked at pricing, we looked at investment structure. What was being offered from an employee education standpoint, because this will be a big change for employees and we want to make sure that we're offering good information. What technology is available. We're moving, as you know, technology, we're on technology. Everybody wants access to their information. They want immediate access to their information. So we wanted to make sure we were able to provide that. And then options for the existing PEP and OPEB funds. So as I mentioned, right now we have 3 different vendors managing all sorts of different, the 457 deferred comp plans. We've got some, for the PEP, it's one carrier. For the OPEB, it's another carrier. So we were really trying to find ways to make this a little bit more simple for our staff and from an administrative standpoint, and make sure that we were getting the most bang for our dollar. Establishing the 401A plan would provide the county with the ability to contribute to those retirement accounts as we are. It would be a different plan. We are then providing employees with greater flexibility in how the funds can be withdrawn. They're owned by the individual, so therefore any remaining balance can be passed on to dependents or non-dependent beneficiaries upon death. So that is a drawback to the OPEB and the PEP. That's not really something that is able to be done at this point. So upon death, the funds are just gone. There is a bit of a difference in that a PEP and an OPEB, at separation of service or retirement, they can be used, the funds can be used, but only for healthcare purposes. The 401A withdrawals, can't happen prior to age 59 and a half, or they're subject to a penalty. Or there are certain exceptions within that. Establishing the 401A, we would like to partner with a vendor in conjunction with their 457 offering. So really get down to one vendor instead of having multiple vendors. Combining it all really does get us a greater benefit from a cost saving standpoint due to the economies of scales that it creates. Those cost savings were outlined. It was pretty significant to make that transition. So we are recommending ICMARC. We are recommending that we convert to a single vendor from having the multiple vendors, moving the 457, the PEP and the OPEB funds into ICMARC. We really, after sitting down and interviewing, we're getting some flexibility for our staff, a great deal of flexibility. We're getting cost savings for our staff. They offer all of the additional benefits, the educational opportunities for our staff, the technologies that we're looking for. And it's really a good benefit option for our staff on a go-forward basis. So that is really our recommendation, is that we establish the 401A benefit option and start contributing to that versus the PEP or the OPEB. Effective July 1, 2020. So the first deposit coming up happens between July and August. And then you're asked to review and recommend not only establishing that option with ICMARC as the awarded vendor for that, but to recommend that we make the update to the employee handbook to reflect those changes and discontinue the deposit of funds into the PEP and the OPEB accounts. And then we are also asking for that authorization to consolidate vendors to ICMARC for all of their existing benefit plans to really capitalize on that cost savings. So handbook updates would be brought at a future meeting and brought to the county board prior to those July deposits. So we're looking for the authorization to move forward on these options. Patty Isaacson is also here. She manages kind of all of our benefits. So I thought it would be beneficial for her to be here as well if there's questions.
Okay, thank you very much. That was Heather Murray, our Director of HR. Committee, are there any questions for Heather or for Patty at this point?
Mr. Chair? I'm assuming he said I could go ahead and
You
speak.
could go ahead, Jim.
I think I've got a fairly good handle on the advantages of making this change. Are there any downsides either for the county or for our employees?
The biggest downside that I see, I mentioned in that from the PEP and the OPEB standpoint, withdrawals can be made at retirement or separation at any age. So if somebody separates tomorrow, they can start withdrawing on those funds versus the 401A where you do have to be age 59 and a half. That was the biggest thing that I saw, I guess, from my standpoint. I don't know, Patty, Paul, if there was anything that you had to add, but really there were far more benefits than there were the cons.
The only thing I would add is the general resistance to change that you encounter anytime. It will mean filling out new forms. It will mean that if employees are used to meeting with whichever of the three has been managing their PEP or their OPEB, they're not able to do that anymore. Or their 457, they're not able to do that. That's not insurmountable. And it's certainly a comparatively minor consideration given the benefits that making this shift, I think, is going to afford for our employees.
Thank you. And I think I noticed either in the documentation somewhere that the ICMARC had kind of guaranteed that they provide some service in terms of educating the employees. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So they are an existing vendor and they're not one that we traditionally have brought on site often, not to their fault. It's just, we just haven't, but they do offer those services. We met with their team. We made sure that they were going to be here, be present for our staff and be present for the staff, even if they aren't here. So if staff have questions, yep. So.
And I have one more burning question. And that is, what does ICMARC stand for?
International City County Managers Association Retirement Corporation. Did I do that right, Grant?
Yes.
I fondly call them ICMARC.
I was chuckling when you started doing the long version because of your abbreviated version, Paul.
You know, as long as our employees don't find something to call them.
Anyone else have a question?
I have just a statement. What I've seen in the material, things look very good, and I've got quite a bit of history in regards to this type of situation. So I think it's a good move to consolidate rather than having multiple vendors.
Thank you, Tim. Anyone else, any other supervisors have any questions or comments?
We need a motion to go forward with this. And at this point, the motion would simply be to what? Because eventually we'll have to change some employee handbook language, right?
Correct. Right now,
The motion could be simply to endorse the recommendation of staff with respect to 401A and 457.
What he said, I move.
and the vendor.
And the vendor.
Yes.
Second.
We have a second for that.
Yes.
Tim, Supervisor Tim Leno, thank you. And motion was made by James Tripp. Any other comments? Hearing none. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed at this point? Hearing none, motion passes to have our department go forward with the tasks and working with the new vendor, or not, I guess, new vendor, but consolidating with the vendor. Thank you. Next item on our agenda is authorizing an addendum to wage schedule for unclassified positions. Heather, are you going to do that, or is Patty?
I will take that as well. So as you all know, we have a wage schedule for all of our regular full-time, part-time positions. What was brought to my attention is that we have a deputy sheriff reserve wage schedule that doesn't necessarily come forward when the full wage schedule is reviewed. And then we also have unclassified positions that are identified but aren't necessarily on a schedule. Periodically it comes forward and people say we haven't reviewed wages. We really don't have a process in place, nor do we have it documented as to what that wage range looks like. So what I'm proposing is that we take all of those, attach it as an addendum to the wage schedule. It gets reviewed during every budget process. It's adopted. We have formal documentation of anything that occurs within that wage schedule. At this point in time, that's really all this is doing, is just really bringing that to put a process in place, establish that we actually do have a wage schedule for deputy sheriff reserves, that we do have a wage schedule for unclassified employees, and that it's something that we do look at each budget period. For the deputy sheriff reserve wages, really that initial wage, it's tied right back to the collective bargaining agreement. That makes it simple because they're filling in usually for deputy vacations and those kinds of things, whatever's allowed for in the collective bargaining agreement, or their wage rate is established based on contracts, for example, with the racetrack. So there's no budget impact. Anything that would be done to the 2020 wage schedule would be impacted in any contracts that the sheriff's department would go into. And these are the current wages for these unclassified positions at this point in time. So this again is just really putting a process in place and bringing to light that we do have these additional wages.
Okay, any of the supervisors have any questions as this was presented by Heather? Okay, hearing none. We have a motion to move forward with this proposed creation of, I guess what I'll say, review. Heather, is that a good question? Annual
Yes.
review?
Yep. Yep. And then attaching it to the existing wage schedule.
Okay, everyone understand that? Okay, do we have a motion?
I would move. Sheila Story.
Sheila, sorry, thank you. Second?
A second.
Second by James, or by Mr. Calabrese, I'm sorry. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any other comments or questions? Okay, hearing none. Again, all those in favor, if you would please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed at this time? Hearing none, motion passes to go forward. And the next item on our agenda is authorizing an increase of the county manager and chief financial officer's credit limits for credit cards that are county credit cards. That information was included in your packet. Keith had outlined that and some reasons that he felt would justify that. Keith or Mr. Miller, do you want to address that? Keith, if you would address that, please.
You bet. Keith Stride, Chief Financial Officer for the county. Included in my staff report that was included in the packet was kind of the background research and materials regarding this. Essentially, when the county did declare a state of emergency in reaction to the COVID-19 crisis, we all were asked to take a look at our operations, take a look at what we do, and maybe look ahead to what potential needs could take place, what kind of situations we could be in. And one of them that pertains in finance would be, how would we be able to rapidly adjust to urgent needs for purchases? Let's say we would need a block of rooms to put people up if we had to socially isolate, or if we had to buy a whole a bunch of materials on a very short notice. Our credit card process is on a monthly basis, like most everybody. And so a $5,000 limit, quite frankly, for significant purchases is just inadequate for many reasons. And when I researched this and reached out to peers and talked with others, both inside of and outside of government, many organizations do have at least two of our size, have at least two key officials that have an elevated credit limit to be able to handle emergency short notice. Let's say you have a major piece of equipment in a urgent situation that needs to be repaired. or let's say you have an IT piece of equipment. Like right now, we're utilizing a lot of IT just to continue operations. Well, if we have a failure there, if we have a router die or something like that, or if we have to go out and buy things like we did the headsets to have these meetings and so on, or to be able to send people home, it gives you that flexibility. And that was one of the things that we looked at. County ordinance does charge the Committee on Administration with setting and approving those credit limits. And right now the maximum is $5,000 for a department division head. And it also identifies the county administrative coordinator, which in our case is the county manager, to establish the procedures for that program. So in looking this over and talking it over, I felt it was prudent to bring forward a recommendation, not only in reaction to COVID-19, that kind of brought this to the forefront, but even in situations that are outside of this. So it's not just that's what triggered it, but it doesn't mean it's the only thing that could lead to needs. So in my memo, I just gave some additional situations that I could see, but we could come up with a number of them. It could be emergency purchases. It could be things that increasingly more and more vendors are pushing to use credit cards. They don't want to wait for government to or buyers to process payments, paper checks. They don't want to wait 2-3 weeks for that. Now, you don't want to do it for convenience or for that, but you do want to make sure that you have the flexibility of having a tool if a need comes up. We also run into this with certain group travels. For example, the Wisconsin Counties Association, when the county board goes to that 5,000, when you have a number of people going, charging rooms, things like that, it adds up in a hurry. So with all that background in mind, I presented to the county manager recommendation to increase the credit card limits for 2 positions. One would be the county manager to $75,000 and to the chief financial officer to $60,000. And then under the ordinance, the process or procedure that the county manager would implement if this was approved would be to add additional review and approval steps for the county manager and CFO. Most notably would be to ensure that any purchases beyond $10,000 would require sufficient justification and accountability, both if it's an individual purchase of $10,000 or if it's a group purchase, such as a series of things related to equipment or an event. And it would require both the county manager and the CFO to confirm and agree to making the charge in advance before it happens. In the event that one of those 2 positions was not available, then the recommendation would be that the county board chair or vice chair would review and give their approval if they agree with it. So that adds an elevated level of review for significant purchases. So it's not just that any one of these 2 positions can just go off and unilaterally make a major purchase like this. So it does provide safeguards in place, which in some cases, this is above what others do, but trying to present a balance of, okay, if we're going to do this increase, what are our safeguards to protect the county's financial interests? So the county manager and chief financial officer do recommend approval of this increase, and then the implementation under the county manager's direction for those procedures I just described.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Supervisors, any questions or comments at this point?
I have a question.
Tim Leno, Supervisor Leno, go ahead.
Keith, I was just wondering, jumping from 5,000 to 75,000, what does the credit card provider have to say about that?
Credit card provider extends us credit, and with the number of cards that we have, it's well above that. Initially, they did offer in some of the transitions to have 1 position at 75,000 just to start, and so I don't believe that would be a concern at this point.
So we've got the credit for it then.
Yes.
Excellent. That's all.
Mr. Chair,
Okay, Sheila Story, you're next up.
You're muted, Sheila. Sheila, you're muted. There you go.
Am I there?
Yes.
What I was going to say, thank you, Mr. Chair, is that in the event that we did have one of those large purchases, maybe a $50,000 purchase or expense of some sort, is there a plan on how those big purchases would be paid back? Would it be a monthly amount that would be in line with the amount, or would it be paid back in a different way? How would it be paid back?
Great question. I apologize for not covering that. I intended to. Our process right now is that the credit card company, which is through Bremer Bank, actually does a transmit and does pull from our accounts. So they are paid and they would be paid like normal. But what it does is it would just elevate the ability for these two positions to make charges above that, but then have to document that when we load them into the financial system to provide that accountability and have that on hand for review. But the payments themselves would be as they currently are.
Thank you, Mr. Stride.
You're welcome.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Tripp, go ahead, please. Supervisor Tripp.
I'm assuming that any purchases made by the credit card show up on our vouchers that we approve at the end of the month. Would there be any desirability or possibility of highlighting these purchases that reach the level, say, of $5 to $50 or whatever $1,000? And again, I'm thinking about accountability, and I don't know that that's necessarily important. So I'm kind of thinking out loud here. But we would be able to see those charges on our vouchers just as we do every other purchase, right?
That's correct. There would be no change in the report out. One thing we could consider is, I proposed the $10,000 limit. We could do a report out on that very easily. Again, because we're elevating the process here with this proposed increase for just these two positions. The county manager and myself could very easily provide that as a additional report out at any time that we would reach that level, and again, to increase that accountability, because that is totally the intent here, is to provide the tool, provide the flexibility, but have that accountability built in.
Thank you. And frankly, I think if somebody's going to diddle us out of a bunch of money, they're going to do it $1,000 at a time, not one great big $80,000 purchase. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tripp. Any other questions or comments by our supervisors? Okay, I have just a couple, and Jim, you brought this up, and Keith, you somewhat covered it, and that is, I think I would love to see in this process, especially any major purchases over, say, $5,000, just be listed on the vouchers. Whether it be Mr. Miller's card or Keith's card, even separately, so we kind of look at those as a special account. I guess that would take away my jitters somewhat, so to speak, when we talk about going from $10,000 for two people to $135,000. But I also see that there could be some real necessary uses here, and I just want to make sure we are making ourselves accountable, not only as staff, but also as a committee. Any other comments? If not, would someone like to make a motion in regard to this request? Tim Leno, would you like to make a motion?
Yeah, I'll move that we move forward with it. And then also your comment, Vaughn, would be to have those broken out I think is a good idea on the voucher report.
Thank you, Tim. Anything else?
Need a second.
Second?
Second.
Supervisor Story seconds. Tim Lenow made the motion. Any comments?
Can I ask that we clarify the motion? Is the motion to go ahead with this and include an accountability provision that anything over $10,000 is what, highlighted, singled out? I'm not quite clear as, Tim, I think I know what you were saying, and I agree with Vaughn and you as well. I'm just wondering exactly what the motion says.
I'll accept your clarification here, Tim.
Well, I don't think it was very clear, though. It isn't to me,
No.
and I said it.
What I heard was a motion to approve the recommendation of staff with respect to increasing the credit limits for the county manager and CFO's credit cards, with the caveat that the voucher report highlight, or there be a separate report perhaps, of the utilization of those credit cards for any purchases over $10,000.
That was
Yeah,
my understanding as well.
I mean, that's the way that Supervisor Lenow expressed it, word for word, I'm pretty sure.
Absolutely.
Is that clear to everyone at this point? What we're asking in our motion and our second. Okay, hearing no further discussion. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed at this time? Hearing none, motion passes. Thank all of you. Okay, audit of the vouchers. Were there any questions as to that pertain to the vouchers themselves?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Tripp, Supervisor Tripp, go ahead.
I have a couple of things. One of them is a reference to the first page of the voucher report. It's on page 24 of the packet, if you've got it up on your computer. And what it is, as a matter of fact, it shows up in a number of places. And here's my question. It's small charges to Shredaway, which is a firm, I believe, that comes in and takes care of all documents, right? But it's charged to operating supplies. And my question really goes to, how do we determine the cost element name when it comes to things like that? I would have expected that to be contractual services or something else. And the reason I ask this is because I think the clearer we are about the items on the voucher report, the more confidence we can have when we do approve those. And so it may seem like a kind of a minor point, and maybe it is. But why would that Shredaway be listed as operating supplies? If that's operating supplies, then conceivably anything could be. You cover up a lot of sins with operating supplies.
Mr. Chair, if I can, I'll address at least part of that.
Okay, Mr. Stry, our CFO, is on.
Sure. And first, I agree with you 100%. We want to ensure the best clarity we can in all of our financial reporting. I can also say there are certain areas that could use improvement, because there are times when, I personally can't review every single code that's being placed by departments and divisions as they're coding these bills for payment processing. I too would have to take a look at that. And I do tend to agree with you that operating supplies, while it's in the general area of where I would category of where I would classify that, is acceptable. It's operations. Which part of operations, yeah, that's not as clear as maybe it could be. When you're making these judgment calls, contracted services, this one's a little bit on the light side, that maybe on that border of whether you would want to call it a true contract versus, going out and hiring an IT vendor or an attorney or something like that. So sometimes these are the types of charges that you would do in-house. Doing shredding. In this case, we are using a firm that comes in and does this. But yeah, your point is definitely very well made, and that's something that we can continue to educate people on to make sure that we're coding things that kind of make sense.
Thank you. I have a couple of other questions, and actually one of these I'm going to direct to Supervisor Story because I should probably know it, and I bet she does. But in the jail report, this is on page 30 of the packet, there's a separate item for state inmate food, and they all go to the same company. And I'm wondering, Sheila, is the sheriff isolating all of those costs? Because I know he was going to try to give us a report at the end of the year about whether how much taking in the state prisoners is going to bring us some revenue. And I was wondering if that was isolating those food costs was part of that effort to give an overall accounting.
Well, I don't know if that was his intent, but it is my thought that he does want to have some kind of an itemized list of all the expenses that are part of the overall amount that we receive from them to see what the actual profit would be so that he could report that to the committee.
Mr. Chair, I can also add to that if you don't mind.
If you would, please.
Yes, Sheriff Big did discuss with me in setting up this program, the administration on this. And you are correct that my recollection from our conversations is we wanted to clearly break out and have separate accounts for costs related to the state inmates. There are some costs that in housing those inmates that were unique to the state operations in comparison to our current inmates through the county system. For example, the purchase of, I believe it's certain items of clothing that we don't provide to county inmates, but the state requires as part of the contract. So yes, there was a deliberate effort to be able to break out as much as possible and reasonable any of those types of separate charges.
Thank you. And then I had just one comment. And that is that the monthly total for the vouchers is significantly lower than we have seen in any month that I can recall. Can that be attributed to the isolation and the fact that we're on a limited work schedule, and or what is the attribution to that?
Well, many times it does come down to timing. There are certain times of the year you get towards the end of the year, final annual bills come out. This is, I don't have the time frame in front of me, but yeah, there are certain points in the year where it will be higher or lower than others. Yes, this is unusually low. That could be part of it. There could be some lags. I mean, there was a period of time for a week or two while we were making adjustments to operations to get as many people working remotely as possible. That I'm sure that had an impact on processing things. People were paying bills on time, but it did certainly slow down people's focus on everything because they were also trying to get people out and set up to work remotely.
Thank you.
Is that all, Jim? Okay. Anybody else have any questions about the vouchers?
I have one statement, more or less. I noticed, I think it was last month or the month before, the amount of the vouchers was 2.2 million or 2.5. And so I think this is just kind of an average out at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Lino. Appreciate that. And I think you're probably right. If not, at this point, need a motion to accept the payment of those vouchers of $649,581.21. If someone would make that motion, please.
So moved.
So move, Supervisor Lino. The second, please.
A second.
Second by Mr. Supervisor Calabrese. Any other questions? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, motion passes with the vouchers. Okay, our next item is consideration of reports, resolutions, and ordinances to the county board from the Committee on Administration. We have a resolution adopting the Families First Coronavirus Response Act provisions. Mr. Miller, or was Miss?
We'll ask Ms. Murray to weigh in on that, please.
Okay, Heather is going to do that for us. Okay.
Yes.
Our HR director, Heather, if you would, please.
On March 18th, President Trump signed the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, FFCRA, for employees that would be impacted by COVID-19. The act took effect April 1st of 2020. It sunsets December 31 of 2020. In response to that, we developed an internal policy with regard to the Family Medical Leave Act. It's the Family Medical Emergency Response Act, and then the Emergency Paid Sick Leave policy. So within that, we also had to define what was the definition of emergency responder, what was the definition of healthcare provider. It took a while for definitions to come out from the federal government, but we did eventually get those, which basically said we could define them ourselves. So what we did with the emergency declaration was worked with Mr. Miller to put together the policy as was outlined by FFCRA, also defined emergency responder, defined healthcare provider, and adopted that effective April 1st. And there are a lot of provisions within there. There's 6 different definitions under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. So it's kind of a flow chart of events. So we've included what that policy looks like. As we looked at it, we noticed that there was a big gap in that those that are kind of frontline for us, our emergency responders and our healthcare providers that were excluded, could potentially still get COVID-19. They're out there, they're working with the individuals. So we did also, in addition to the response to FFCRA internal to our organization, say, if our emergency responders or our healthcare providers do contract COVID-19 and they do have to quarantine or isolate, due to that, we as an organization will pay them the 80 hours that somebody who is not an emergency responder and is not a healthcare provider in our organization would be compensated under FFCRA. So we wanted to recognize the fact that if they do have to miss work because they've contracted COVID-19. So we did put that policy together as well, which was included in the materials. It is a lot more restrictive. The Emergency Family Medical Leave Act really provides family medical leave to employees to care for children because daycares and schools are closed. That's not something that's being afforded to emergency responders and healthcare providers because we really do need and value the things that they're doing to keep things going. So really what we're looking for the committee to do by resolution is just to reinforce and adopt these 2 policies and the definitions of emergency responders and healthcare providers.
Thank you, Heather. Any supervisors have any questions or comments for Heather about, we do have a resolution and it is printed out and you have it in front of you.
I guess I have a question. I thought I read it and I'm just trying to find the answer. Maybe you can answer it right away. What happens if somebody from one of our other departments gets tested positive, or they've been in contact with somebody, so we've asked them to stay home for 2 weeks? What happens for them for pay?
A non-emergency responder or a non-healthcare provider? Okay, so it depends. If they're being tested, that's one provision. I'm just going to read it real quick. If they are experiencing symptoms and they're seeking a medical diagnosis, they would be compensated at 100% of their wages if they up to 80 hours, and that's under the FFCRA. So if they test positive and they have to isolate for 14 days, then they would receive 14 days worth of compensation. There's another provision that says if they have to care for a child, then it's 2/3 of their wages. So
Yeah.
anything that's caring for a child or caring for someone and you're not the specific person being tested or diagnosed, then it's 2/3 of your wages.
So if someone was in contact with someone that had it and they didn't test positive yet, but we asked them to stay home for 2 weeks, they would get 2/3 or they
Nope.
would get
If
100%?
we then in that situation, it's actually benefit time or unpaid time. That doesn't fall into these provisions.
Okay,
A healthcare provider has to have them isolating. Now, and that's where the area gets a little bit gray, because if our health department says it, then we consider them a healthcare provider. And therefore, if they have told them to quarantine for 14 days, then they would qualify in this provision, and then it would be the 2/3 pay.
all right, thank you.
Mhm.
Mr.
Any
Chair,
other? Go ahead,
Tripp,
Mr. Tripp. Supervisor Tripp, go ahead.
I'm assuming that, well, I'm not assuming, if it happened, there could be some substantial costs involved to the county. Is there federal money backing up this provision in that $28.82 quadrillion package that Congress passed?
My short answer is not at this time.
The somewhat longer answer is that the state of Wisconsin, along with the other states, has been allocated a little over $2 billion, a large chunk of which is at the discretion of the governor to decide how it's going to be dispersed. The Wisconsin Counties Association, as you know, Supervisor Tripp, has already forwarded a request to the governor that 30% of those funds be allocated specifically for counties to offset these costs. But it remains to be seen, even in that case, which costs will qualify. There's a lot of talk about additional costs that are directly attributable to COVID. And the anticipation is that if people have to stay home for testing, for instance, that would qualify, but it's not a guarantee until the details get worked out. And in this case in particular, the devil is going to be in the details. As it stands right now, however, it is our cost and we get to pay it regardless if we get any reimbursement.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer. And I did notice in the vouchers that our COVID-19 expenses are being isolated. And I know that the Counties Association and actually the governor's office has asked counties to keep track of that too. So I'm a little bit hopeful that some of that federal money will find its way back to cover our expenses for this. Thank you.
And may I add one more thing on
Yeah,
that detail?
Go ahead, Heather.
Is that in addition to what you're seeing in the vouchers, we have established pay codes specific to COVID and specific to these 6 or 7, excuse me, instances. And so we are tracking it by however they're being compensated, and so that we can get a clear report should that come through for us.
Thank you very much, Heather. Anyone else? Okay, at this
Supervisor
point,
Story has her hand raised.
Supervisor Story, go ahead.
Sheila, you're still muted.
How about now?
You're better.
Just wanted to get some clarification. I'm a little confused, so you may have already answered this, but in the event that they did test positive, the ones that we're talking about, the group that we're talking about, and they're going to be compensated. I understand that's not going to be money that's coming out of their benefits. That's going to be additional monies out of our budget. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. But in the event that there's another employee that is not a health worker that does contract a positive test or has to leave, that is where the monies would be paid, or the payroll would be paid out of their benefits. Is that correct?
Any employee that tests positive would be compensated without having to use benefits.
So benefits are not even a factor at all.
They are
If
not.
anybody can track it, no matter who.
And, you know, I just want to clarify the additional budget. It's just them not utilizing benefits. So it's still money. It was dollars that were budgeted for if they're full-time 2,080 hours for the year. It's just that their benefit leave banks are not impacted should they contract COVID.
Okay, thank you.
You're
If
welcome.
they stay home, I will add, if they stay home, say for childcare, and Heather can correct me, that's where their pay compensation is 2/3 of their pay, but they can use their bank of vacation or sick leave to bring up their entire compensation to 100%.
Well, that is why I was confused, because in the
Mhm.
school district, given the school district is
Right.
closed, you are utilizing whatever you have in your reserve account for sick time or whatever, and that is being utilized. Or in the event that there are people that have monies to give out of that benefit account, they're
Mhm.
being put out in a pool to help those that don't have it. So
Right.
that's what I was wondering about.
So the distinction is between a positive diagnosis of COVID versus having to stay at home with COVID to provide childcare.
I understand. Thank you for the clarification.
Any other questions? If not, we have a resolution in front of us. Is there a
Need a
motion?
motion.
Any supervisors
Also
like to
move.
make a motion?
Is that Mr. Bartlett?
Yes.
Chairman Bartlett, thank you.
I will second.
Second by Sheila Story. Any other comments or questions? Hearing none. All those in favor, say aye, please. Aye. Anyone opposed? Hearing none opposed, motion passes.
That resolution will go forward to the county board at its meeting in May.
Thank you. Okay, announcements, or do we have any other,
No, that's
anything for Heather? No, we're good. Okay. Announcements, our next meeting date is May 28th, 2020. And details of that meeting are not finalized, obviously, at this point, whether or not we will be together or be doing it as we're doing it today. Stay tuned, group. That's all I can tell you. Everyone, please stay safe.
Any other announcements from anybody else?
Anyone else have announcements they'd like to make?
I don't know if this is the right time, but I just have a question regarding the bond issue that was almost in motion and not and canceled. Just wondering where that might be in the future. I was really kind of posing the question to Keith.
Could I interject and just say it's a pretty weighty substantive issue and it wasn't on the agenda. I think if you want to call the county manager and ask him about it, you can, but it's not appropriate to discuss it at the meeting.
All right.
Okay.
I'll take that under advisement.
Thank you very much, Corp Counsel. Appreciate that. Any other announcements? If not, stay healthy, stay safe, and stay 6 feet apart, please. We'll see you next month. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Meeting
you.
is adjourned.
Nice job.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.